The birth and family background of Friedrich Nietzsche in 1844 provide essential insight into the origins of one of the most provocative thinkers of modern times. Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small village of Röcken, located in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. This rural setting, far removed from the major intellectual centers of Europe, shaped the early atmosphere of his life. Nietzsche entered the world during a period of social conservatism, religious authority, and growing political tension, forces that would later become central targets of his philosophical critique. Nietzsche was born into a deeply religious and culturally traditional family. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, known for his education, discipline, and strong sense of duty. He served a local parish and was respected within the community, embodying the moral and spiritual authority of Protestant Germany. Nietzsche's mother, Franziska Nietzsche, came from a similarly devout background and was considerably younger than her husband. The household was structured, pious, and intellectually serious, with daily life closely tied to religious practice and clerical responsibility. Tragedy struck the family early and left a lasting imprint on Nietzsche's childhood. When Nietzsche was only 4 years old, his father fell gravely ill and died shortly thereafter, followed soon by the death of Nietzsche's younger brother. These losses abruptly transformed the family structure. The household became dominated by women: his mother, grandmother, 2 aunts, and his younger sister Elizabeth. This matriarchal environment, shaped by mourning and emotional restraint, profoundly influenced Nietzsche's early psychological development and sense of isolation. After his father's death, the family moved to the nearby town of Naumburg. There, Nietzsche grew up in a quieter but intellectually attentive environment. Despite limited financial resources, his family placed great importance on education, discipline, and moral seriousness. Nietzsche proved to be an exceptionally gifted child, especially in language, music, and literature. He was introspective, sensitive, and precociously thoughtful, traits that set him apart from his peers and hinted at his future intellectual intensity. Religion remained a central force in Nietzsche's upbringing, but it was not unchallenged. While he was immersed in Christian teaching and scripture from an early age, the absence of his father, once the spiritual authority of the household, created a subtle tension between belief and loss. This tension would later evolve into Nietzsche's lifelong struggle with faith, morality, and meaning. The very religious framework that shaped his early years would become the foundation against which he defined his most radical ideas. In retrospect, Nietzsche's birth and family background reveal a striking paradox. Raised in a devout Christian household and expected to follow a respectable intellectual path, he would later emerge as one of Christianity's most uncompromising critics. The quiet village of Röcken, the pastor's home, and the atmosphere of discipline and grief formed the emotional and cultural groundwork of his thought. Far from being incidental, these early conditions helped shape a philosopher whose ideas would challenge the moral and spiritual foundations of Western civilization itself. The early childhood and religious upbringing of Friedrich Nietzsche unfolded within a world shaped by devotion, discipline, and quiet emotional tension. Born into a Lutheran pastoral family, Nietzsche's earliest years were immersed in the rhythms of Christian life. Prayer, scripture, and moral instruction were not abstract ideas, but daily practices that structured the household. The parsonage was both a home and a symbol of spiritual authority. And from the beginning, Nietzsche was surrounded by expectations of reverence, obedience, and inner seriousness. The death of Nietzsche's father, when he was still very young, dramatically altered the emotional landscape of his childhood. His father had embodied religious authority, learning, and paternal guidance, and his sudden absence created a lasting sense of loss. This event did more than change family dynamics. It introduced Nietzsche to the experience of fragility at the heart of faith. The religious worldview that promised order and meaning now coexisted with suffering and unanswered questions, planting the seeds of an inner tension that would later define his thinking. After the loss of his father, Nietzsche grew up in a household dominated by women, his mother, grandmother, aunts, and sister, where moral discipline and emotional restraint were strongly emphasized. Religion remained central, but it took on a more inward and dutiful character rather than one grounded in authority and confidence. Nietzsche was encouraged to be well-behaved, reflective, and serious beyond his years. This environment fostered introspection and sensitivity, shaping a child who observed the world quietly and deeply rather than participating in it impulsively. From an early age, Nietzsche displayed exceptional intellectual and artistic gifts. He showed a strong inclination toward reading, writing, and music, often retreating into solitary activities. Biblical texts, hymns, and classical literature formed a large part of his early education. He absorbed religious language fluently, not only as doctrine, but as a powerful form of expression. This deep familiarity with Christian symbolism and moral language would later allow him to critique religion with unusual intensity and precision, speaking from within a tradition he knew intimately. Yet even during childhood, Nietzsche's relationship with religion was not one of simple acceptance. The contrast between religious ideals and lived experience, between promises of divine care and the reality of personal loss, created a quiet but persistent questioning. He did not openly reject faith as a child, but his inward nature meant that doubts were internalized rather than expressed. Religion shaped his moral seriousness, but it also confronted him with contradictions that resisted easy resolution. In later life, Nietzsche would famously challenge Christianity as a life-denying force, but this rebellion cannot be understood without his early religious upbringing. His childhood did not merely expose him to faith, it trained him in discipline, symbolic thinking, and moral depth. The intensity with which he later attacked religious values reflects not distance, but closeness. His early years formed a philosopher who knew belief from the inside, and who would ultimately seek to overturn it with the same seriousness and passion that once sustained it. The theme of exceptional talent and classical education lies at the very core of Friedrich Nietzsche's early intellectual development. From a remarkably young age, Nietzsche distinguished himself through an unusual combination of discipline, sensitivity, and intellectual intensity. Unlike many gifted children whose talents emerge unevenly, Nietzsche showed strength across language, literature, music, and critical thought. His abilities were not merely academic, they reflected a deep internal seriousness and an instinctive attraction to the intellectual world of antiquity. Nietzsche's formal education reached a decisive turning point when he was admitted to the prestigious boarding school of Schulpforta, one of the most rigorous classical institutions in Germany. Entry into Forta was itself a mark of extraordinary promise, reserved for students of exceptional ability and discipline. Life at the school was demanding and austere, structured around strict routines, intellectual rigor, and moral self-control. Far from discouraging Nietzsche, This environment sharpened his focus and reinforced his capacity for sustained, solitary study. At Schulpforta, Nietzsche received an intensive education in classical languages, particularly Greek and Latin. He did not approach these subjects mechanically, as exercises in grammar alone, but as gateways into entire civilizations. Ancient texts were studied closely, line by line, fostering precision, patience, and interpretive depth. Nietzsche developed an intimate relationship with Greek literature, especially tragedy, lyric poetry, and philosophy. These texts were not relics of the past to him. They were living expressions of human strength, conflict, and creativity. What set Nietzsche apart, even among gifted peers, was the originality of his engagement with classical material. He did not simply master existing interpretations, but questioned them, sensing tensions and contradictions where others accepted harmony. His early essays and translations already displayed a distinctive voice, analytical, bold, and often critical of prevailing scholarly assumptions. Teachers recognized not only his brilliance, but also his independence of mind, an intellectual trait that would later define his philosophical style. Alongside his classical studies, Nietzsche cultivated a deep passion for music, particularly composition and musical theory. This artistic sensitivity complemented his philological training, sharpening his sense of rhythm, tone, and emotional expression. Music and classical literature together shaped his understanding of culture as a living force, rather than an abstract system. This fusion of artistic and scholarly sensibility would later inform his unique philosophical prose, which often reads more like literature than academic argument. Nietzsche's exceptional talent and classical education did more than prepare him for a scholarly career. They shaped the foundations of his entire worldview. His later critiques of morality, culture, and modernity were deeply rooted in his early immersion in ancient thought. The discipline of classical philology trained him to read closely, think historically, and challenge inherited interpretations. In this sense, Nietzsche's radical philosophy did not emerge in opposition to classical education, but from within it, transforming the tools of tradition into instruments of profound intellectual rebellion. The studies in philology at Bonn and Leipzig marked a decisive phase in the intellectual formation of Friedrich Nietzsche, transforming early brilliance into disciplined scholarship. After completing his demanding education at Schulpforta, Nietzsche entered the University of Bonn in 1864 with the expectation of continuing along a respectable academic path. Initially enrolled in theology as well as philology, he quickly discovered that formal religious study no longer spoke to his inner questions. Philology, the rigorous study of ancient languages, texts, and cultures, became his true intellectual home. At Bonn, Nietzsche encountered the realities of university life, both inspiring and disappointing. While he respected the depth of classical scholarship, he found much of the academic atmosphere uninspiring and socially distracting. Student culture, marked by dueling fraternities and conventional ambitions, held little appeal for his introspective temperament. Nietzsche withdrew from many aspects of student life, focusing instead on private study and intellectual refinement. This period sharpened his sense that true thinking required distance from conformity and intellectual routine. A turning point came when Nietzsche transferred to the University of Leipzig in 1865. There, he studied under Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most respected classical philologists of the time. Nietzsche immediately recognized Nietzsche's exceptional abilities, particularly his precision, originality, and sensitivity to textual detail. Under Ritschl's guidance, Nietzsche flourished academically, immersing himself in ancient Greek literature, metrics, and textual criticism with extraordinary intensity. Leipzig provided Nietzsche with an environment more suited to his intellectual needs. He worked with relentless focus, producing scholarly work that impressed even seasoned academics. His research displayed not only technical mastery, but also interpretive boldness. Nietzsche was already moving beyond conventional philology, treating ancient texts not merely as linguistic puzzles, but as expressions of deep cultural and psychological forces. This approach hinted at the philosophical direction his later work would take. During his Leipzig years, Nietzsche also encountered ideas that profoundly influenced his worldview. It was here that he discovered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, an encounter he later described as transformative. Schopenhauer's emphasis on suffering, will, and the tragic nature of existence resonated deeply with Nietzsche and interacted powerfully with his classical studies, especially his engagement with Greek tragedy. Philology and philosophy began to merge in his thinking, blurring the boundaries between scholarly analysis and existential reflection. The success of Nietzsche's studies at Leipzig was remarkable. Before completing his doctorate, he was already regarded as a rising star in the field. In 1869, largely on Ritschl's recommendation, Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, an extraordinary achievement for someone so young. His time at Bonn and Leipzig had not only refined his scholarly skills, but also laid the groundwork for a radical transformation of philology into a vehicle for cultural and philosophical critique. From these academic beginnings emerged a thinker who would soon challenge the very foundations of European thought. The appointment at the University of Basel marked a remarkable and unexpected milestone in the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. In 1869, at just 24 years old and before completing a doctoral degree, Nietzsche was offered a full professorship in classical philology. Such an appointment was extraordinarily rare and testified to the exceptional confidence placed in his abilities by leading scholars of the time. The decision was strongly supported by his mentor, Friedrich Ritschl, whose recommendation carried immense weight within academic circles. The University of Basel, though smaller than the great German institutions, provided an intellectually vibrant environment. Located in Switzerland, it offered a degree of cultural openness and independence that appealed to Nietzsche's temperament. The appointment also required Nietzsche to renounce his Prussian citizenship, effectively aligning himself with a more international academic identity. This step symbolized his early detachment from German institutional traditions, a detachment that would later deepen into cultural and philosophical critique. As a professor, Nietzsche approached teaching with seriousness and intensity. His lectures on Greek literature, rhetoric, and tragedy were intellectually demanding and often unconventional. Rather than treating ancient texts as static objects of linguistic analysis, he presented them as living expressions of culture, power, and human struggle. Students encountered not only grammar and philology, but a vision of antiquity charged with philosophical significance. This approach made his teaching distinctive, though not always widely popular. Nietzsche's academic position also placed him at the crossroads of scholarship and creative thought. While fulfilling his duties as a philologist, he increasingly felt constrained by the narrow expectations of the discipline. Basel provided him with both security and tension, the stability of a respected professorship, and the growing sense that purely academic work could not contain his expanding intellectual ambitions. During this period, the boundaries between philology, philosophy, and cultural criticism began to blur in his work. The Basel years were also marked by Nietzsche's deepening involvement with contemporary intellectual figures, most notably the composer Richard Wagner. Their friendship and shared admiration for ancient Greek tragedy influenced Nietzsche's early writings and reinforced his belief that culture, art, and philosophy were inseparable. The university setting thus became not just a workplace, but a stage for broader cultural engagement and experimentation. In retrospect, Nietzsche's appointment at the University of Basel stands as both a triumph and a turning point. It confirmed his extraordinary scholarly promise while exposing the limits of academic life for a mind as restless as his own. The position gave him authority and recognition, yet it also sharpened his awareness of how radical his ideas truly were. From this unlikely professorship would emerge a thinker who would soon move far beyond the boundaries of philology, reshaping modern philosophy in the process. The friendship between Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Wagner was one of the most intense and consequential intellectual relationships of the 19th century. When Friedrich Nietzsche first encountered the music and personality of Richard Wagner, he experienced it as a revelation. Wagner appeared to Nietzsche not merely as a composer, but as a cultural force capable of renewing German art, philosophy, and spirit. At a time when Nietzsche was still defining his intellectual identity, Wagner offered a powerful model of artistic genius and cultural ambition. Their personal relationship deepened after Nietzsche's appointment at the University of Basel. Wagner and his wife Cosima lived nearby at Tribschen on Lake Lucerne, and Nietzsche became a frequent guest. These visits were marked by long conversations, musical performances, and shared reflections on ancient Greece, tragedy, and the future of European culture. Nietzsche admired Wagner's commanding presence and visionary confidence, seeing in him a modern counterpart to the great creators of antiquity. Wagner, in turn, recognized Nietzsche's brilliance and treated the young professor as a promising intellectual ally. At the core of their friendship was a shared belief in the cultural importance of art. Both men rejected what they saw as the emptiness of modern civilization, shaped by materialism, shallow rationalism, and declining spiritual depth. Nietzsche believed Wagner's music dramas had the potential to revive the tragic spirit of ancient Greece, uniting music, myth, and philosophy into a single cultural force. This admiration found its most explicit expression in Nietzsche's early work, The Birth of Tragedy, where Wagner is presented as the modern artist capable of restoring a lost unity of life and art. Yet the very intensity of this bond contained the seeds of its eventual collapse. As Nietzsche's thinking evolved, he began to distance himself from Wagner's growing nationalism, religious symbolism, and cult-like following. Wagner's increasing emphasis on Christian themes and German identity conflicted sharply with Nietzsche's developing critique of morality, religion, and mass culture. What had once appeared as cultural renewal now struck Nietzsche as a retreat into sentimentality and ideological comfort. The break between Nietzsche and Wagner was gradual but deeply painful. Nietzsche did not simply abandon a friend. He felt compelled to reject a worldview that had once shaped his deepest hopes. This rupture forced him into intellectual isolation, but it also liberated his thought. In later works, Nietzsche reassessed Wagner with sharp criticism, portraying him as a symptom of cultural decadence rather than its cure. The emotional intensity of their friendship gave way to an equally intense philosophical opposition. In retrospect, the friendship with Wagner was a defining chapter in Nietzsche's development. It provided inspiration, direction, and a powerful example of artistic ambition, while also serving as a catalyst for Nietzsche's independence. By confronting and ultimately rejecting Wagner, Nietzsche clarified his own path as a thinker willing to stand alone against admired authorities. The rise and fall of this friendship reflects a broader drama in Nietzsche's life. The painful but necessary separation from idols in the pursuit of intellectual honesty and radical self-definition. The early works of Friedrich Nietzsche, culminating in The Birth of Tragedy, reveal a young scholar in the midst of transforming himself from a classical philologist into a radical cultural thinker. Friedrich Nietzsche entered intellectual life through rigorous academic training, but his earliest writings already showed signs of restlessness with purely technical scholarship. He was less interested in preserving antiquity as an object of study than in understanding its power to shape life, art, and culture. This ambition set his early work apart from conventional philology and foreshadowed the revolutionary path his philosophy would take. Before publishing The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche produced a number of lectures, essays, and unpublished notes that explored Greek literature, rhetoric, and aesthetics. Even in these early efforts, he treated ancient texts not as isolated artifacts, but as expressions of deep cultural forces. He sought to uncover what made Greek civilization vital, creative, and tragically aware of existence. This approach already hinted at a broader philosophical concern: how cultures confront suffering, meaning, and the limits of reason. Published in 1872, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music marked Nietzsche's dramatic entrance into the intellectual world. Rather than offering a narrow academic study, the book presented a bold reinterpretation of ancient Greek tragedy. Nietzsche argued that Greek culture was shaped by the tension between two artistic forces: the Apollonian, associated with order, clarity, and form, and the Dionysian, associated with ecstasy, chaos, and the dissolution of boundaries. Tragedy, he claimed, arose from the creative balance between these opposing energies. Central to Nietzsche's argument was the idea that tragedy allowed the Greeks to confront the harshness of existence without retreating into denial or moral comfort. Through music, myth, and dramatic form, tragedy transformed suffering into something meaningful and even life-affirming. Nietzsche believed that this tragic wisdom had been destroyed by the rise of rationalism, especially through the influence of Socratic philosophy. According to his account, excessive faith in reason weakened the Greek spirit and led to the decline of tragic art. The book also reflected Nietzsche's deep admiration for Richard Wagner, whom he portrayed as a modern artist capable of reviving the tragic spirit. Wagner's music, in Nietzsche's view at the time, represented a return to the Dionysian power of art, capable of challenging the emptiness of modern culture. This alignment with Wagner gave The Birth of Tragedy a polemical edge, linking ancient Greek tragedy directly to contemporary cultural debates. It also exposed Nietzsche to criticism from academic colleagues who viewed the work as unscientific and speculative. The reception of The Birth of Tragedy was largely hostile within scholarly circles. Critics accused Nietzsche of abandoning philological rigor in favor of metaphysical fantasy. Yet this rejection proved decisive rather than discouraging. It clarified Nietzsche's distance from traditional scholarship and pushed him toward a more independent intellectual path. What appeared to many as a flawed academic work was, in fact, the first expression of a new kind of thinking, one that fused philosophy, art, psychology, and cultural criticism. In retrospect, Nietzsche's early works and The Birth of Tragedy represent the opening act of his philosophical drama. They introduced themes that would define his later thought: the critique of rationalism, the role of art in confronting suffering, and the search for life-affirming values beyond morality and tradition. Though Nietzsche would later revise and even criticize this early book, it remains a foundational text, revealing a thinker already willing to challenge his discipline, his culture, and himself in pursuit of a deeper understanding of human existence. The break with Richard Wagner and the rise of intellectual independence marked one of the most painful yet decisive turning points in the life of Friedrich Nietzsche. What had once been a relationship of admiration, loyalty, and shared cultural vision gradually transformed into estrangement and critique. Wagner, who had initially embodied Nietzsche's hopes for a cultural rebirth, came to represent everything Nietzsche would later resist. This rupture was not sudden, but the result of a long process of internal conflict and philosophical awakening. The first signs of tension emerged as Wagner's artistic direction changed. Nietzsche grew increasingly uncomfortable with Wagner's growing emphasis on nationalism, German identity, and religious symbolism. Wagner's later works, especially those associated with the Bayreuth Festival, appeared to Nietzsche as theatrical, moralizing, and aimed at mass appeal rather than genuine cultural renewal. What Nietzsche once saw as tragic depth now struck him as sentimental spectacle. This shift challenged Nietzsche's early belief that Wagner could revive the spirit of ancient Greek tragedy. The Bayreuth Festival of 1876 became a symbolic breaking point. Nietzsche attended with high expectations, but left deeply disillusioned. The atmosphere surrounding Wagner felt to him like a cult, dominated by uncritical admiration and ideological conformity. The experience intensified Nietzsche's sense that Wagner had become part of the very cultural decadence he claimed to oppose. Art, Nietzsche concluded, should challenge and elevate the individual, not seduce the masses with comforting myths and emotional excess. This growing distance was not merely aesthetic, it reflected a profound philosophical divergence. Nietzsche's thinking was moving toward a radical critique of morality, religion, and metaphysical comfort. Wagner's increasing turn toward Christian themes and redemption narratives stood in direct opposition to Nietzsche's emerging vision of life affirmation and tragic strength. To remain loyal to Wagner would have required Nietzsche to compromise his intellectual honesty, something he was unwilling to do. The break with Wagner was deeply personal and emotionally costly. Nietzsche lost not only a friend, but a figure he had once regarded almost as a spiritual guide. This separation intensified his isolation, both socially and intellectually. Yet it also liberated him. Freed from Wagner's influence, Nietzsche began to develop a more experimental and independent style of writing. His later works display sharper critique, greater psychological insight, and a willingness to confront ideas without protective alliances or idols. In the aftermath of the break, Nietzsche openly reassessed Wagner's significance. In later writings, he portrayed Wagner as a symptom of cultural decline rather than its solution. This reversal was not an act of bitterness alone, but a declaration of independence. By turning away from Wagner, Nietzsche affirmed his commitment to thinking without reverence for authority, even when that authority had once inspired him deeply. The break thus stands as a defining moment in Nietzsche's intellectual journey, a painful renunciation that cleared the path for his most original and uncompromising philosophical ideas. The health problems and resignation from academia marked a decisive rupture in the life of Friedrich Nietzsche, transforming both his daily existence and his intellectual path. From his early years as a professor at the University of Basel, Nietzsche suffered from persistent physical ailments that steadily undermined his ability to teach and conduct academic work. Severe headaches, digestive disorders, eye problems, and periods of extreme exhaustion plagued him with increasing frequency. What began as intermittent illness gradually became a defining condition of his life. Nietzsche's health struggles were not merely physical, but deeply psychological in their effects. Extended bouts of pain forced him into isolation, disrupting his routines and weakening his ties to academic life. Teaching became increasingly difficult, as even short lectures could trigger debilitating symptoms. The structured demands of university life, fixed schedules, public responsibility, and administrative obligations clashed with a body that required rest, solitude, and careful management. Nietzsche found himself trapped between intellectual ambition and physical limitation. In response to his declining health, Nietzsche repeatedly sought relief through travel and changes in climate. He spent time in Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, hoping that fresh air, sunlight, and quieter surroundings might restore his strength. These journeys were acts of necessity rather than leisure. Nietzsche carefully planned his days around his symptoms, working in short, intense bursts followed by long periods of rest. Despite these efforts, his condition showed no lasting improvement. By the late 1870s, it became clear that Nietzsche could no longer fulfill the responsibilities of a university professor. In 1879, at the age of 34, he formally resigned from his position at Basel. The resignation marked the end of his academic career and severed his institutional connection to the scholarly world. Though he was granted a modest pension, Nietzsche now faced a future defined by uncertainty, solitude, and financial fragility. Paradoxically, this withdrawal from academia proved intellectually liberating. Free from lecture schedules, departmental expectations, and disciplinary constraints, Nietzsche was able to reshape his thinking entirely. The works written after his resignation reveal a new voice, more direct, aphoristic, and psychologically penetrating. His philosophy became less concerned with scholarly debate and more focused on the fundamental questions of human existence, morality, power, and creativity. Illness, rather than silencing him, forced him to write differently and more boldly. The period following Nietzsche's resignation demonstrates how suffering and creativity became intertwined in his life. His health problems isolated him from society, but they also sharpened his introspection and intensified his philosophical vision. What appeared outwardly as decline was, intellectually, a period of radical transformation. By leaving academia behind, Nietzsche stepped fully into the role of an independent thinker, one whose ideas would challenge the foundations of Western thought long after his fragile body had failed him. The years of travel and solitary writing represent the most intense and productive phase of Friedrich Nietzsche's intellectual life. After resigning from his academic post, Nietzsche entered a period defined by physical fragility and mental independence. Without a permanent home or institutional support, he lived as a wandering thinker, moving between quiet European towns in search of climates that might ease his suffering. This nomadic existence, though imposed by illness, became the condition under which his most original ideas emerged. Nietzsche's travels followed a seasonal rhythm shaped by health rather than preference. Summers were often spent in the Swiss Alps, particularly in Sils Maria, where the clear air and mountain solitude offered temporary relief. Winters drove him south to Italy, or the French Riviera, where milder weather reduced the severity of his symptoms. These locations were chosen for their calm, distance from academic life, and freedom from social demands. Nietzsche lived simply, often alone in modest lodgings, structuring his days around short walks, careful meals, and limited writing sessions. Solitude was not merely a consequence of Nietzsche's circumstances, it became a philosophical necessity. Removed from intellectual circles and personal attachments, he developed a style of thinking that rejected compromise and convention. His notebooks from this period reveal an intense inner dialogue, marked by sharp observation and self-examination. Writing became an act of survival as well as creation. Nietzsche often described his ideas as arising suddenly during walks, requiring immediate recording before physical pain returned. During these years, Nietzsche produced a series of works that departed radically from traditional philosophical form. Instead of systematic treatises, he wrote in aphorisms, brief reflections, and poetic fragments. This style reflected both his health limitations and his philosophical goals. Short, concentrated expressions allowed him to think deeply without exhausting himself, while also challenging readers to engage actively with his ideas. The result was a body of work that felt personal, provocative, and unsettlingly direct. Isolation also intensified Nietzsche's critique of modern society. Observing culture from a distance, he became increasingly hostile to mass values, moral conformity, and intellectual complacency. His solitude sharpened his sense that true thinking requires separation from collective beliefs. He saw himself as writing for future readers rather than his contemporaries, fully aware that his ideas would likely be misunderstood or rejected. This sense of being intellectually untimely gave his work both urgency and defiance. The years of travel and solitary writing forged Nietzsche's mature philosophical voice. Though marked by illness, loneliness, and instability, this period produced some of the most influential ideas in modern thought. Removed from academic security and social comfort, Nietzsche transformed isolation into creative power. His wandering life became the external reflection of an inner journey, one that led him beyond inherited values and toward a radically new vision of human possibility. The development of key ideas, such as the will to power and the Übermensch, stands at the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche's mature philosophy. These concepts did not appear suddenly or as fixed doctrines. Instead, they emerged gradually from years of reflection, illness, isolation, and confrontation with the moral and intellectual foundations of Western culture. Nietzsche was not attempting to build a closed philosophical system. He was seeking to reinterpret human existence itself, stripping away inherited assumptions and replacing them with more dynamic, life-affirming principles. The idea of the will to power developed as Nietzsche moved beyond traditional explanations of human motivation. He rejected the notion that human behavior is primarily driven by self-preservation, pleasure, or rational calculation. Instead, he proposed that life itself is characterized by an inner drive to expand, assert, shape, and overcome. The will to power is not simply a desire for domination over others. It is a fundamental impulse toward growth, self-expression, and creative transformation. For Nietzsche, Every living being interprets and organizes the world according to its strength, striving to impose form and meaning upon chaos. This concept also represented a radical rethinking of morality. Nietzsche argued that moral systems are not timeless truths, but expressions of particular forms of power. Values arise from the conditions of life that produce them. What is praised as good often reflects the interests of those who have the strength to define it. By exposing morality as a product of the will to power, Nietzsche sought to free individuals from moral frameworks rooted in resentment, guilt, and denial of life. His aim was not moral chaos, but the possibility of creating values grounded in vitality and self-affirmation. The figure of the Übermensch, introduced most vividly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, represents the human response to this challenge. The Übermensch is not a biological superior or political ruler, but an existential ideal. Nietzsche envisioned this figure as someone who creates values rather than inheriting them, who accepts life in all its difficulty without seeking comfort in metaphysical illusions. The Übermensch affirms existence fully, including suffering, contradiction, and impermanence. In this sense, it stands in opposition to what Nietzsche saw as the dominant moral type of his age: cautious, conformist, and fearful of strength. The Übermensch is closely linked to Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism, the realization that traditional values have lost their binding power. With the decline of religious and metaphysical certainty, humanity faces a dangerous emptiness. Nietzsche believed that without new value creators, this void would lead to despair or passive conformity. The Übermensch represents a possible future beyond nihilism, someone capable of transforming the collapse of old meanings into an opportunity for creative renewal. It is a symbol of becoming rather than a final state, emphasizing process over perfection. Together, the will to power and the Übermensch form a dynamic vision of human life. They reject static definitions of truth, morality, and identity, replacing them with movement, struggle, and self-overcoming. Nietzsche did not offer these ideas as doctrines to be accepted, but as provocations meant to unsettle and inspire. Their power lies in their demand that individuals take responsibility for their own values and confront existence without guarantees. In developing these ideas, Nietzsche challenged not only philosophy, but humanity itself, to dare to become something greater than it has been. The major work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, stands as the most daring and unconventional creation of Friedrich Nietzsche. Written between 1883 and 1885, the book marks a decisive break from traditional philosophical writing. Rather than presenting arguments in a systematic or academic form, Nietzsche chose a poetic, prophetic, and deeply symbolic style. The result was neither philosophy in the classical sense nor literature alone, but a hybrid work meant to transform how readers think, feel, and judge values. With Zarathustra, Nietzsche no longer sought to persuade through logic alone. He aimed to reshape the inner world of the reader. The work is structured around the fictional figure of Zarathustra, a solitary teacher who descends from the mountains to speak to humanity. Through this character, Nietzsche dramatizes his philosophy rather than explaining it directly. Zarathustra speaks in parables, riddles, songs, and speeches, echoing religious scripture while simultaneously overturning its moral foundations. This deliberate resemblance to sacred texts is central to the book's power. Nietzsche presents a new voice of proclamation, in order to announce the collapse of old truths. Zarathustra does not offer commandments, but challenges, demanding that listeners confront themselves. At the heart of Thus Spoke Zarathustra lies Nietzsche's declaration that traditional values have lost their authority. The famous announcement of the death of God is not a statement of atheism alone, but a diagnosis of cultural crisis. Zarathustra speaks to a world where inherited meanings no longer guide human life, leaving behind confusion, comfort-seeking, and moral exhaustion. Nietzsche portrays modern humanity as caught between fear of collapse and resistance to transformation, clinging to familiar beliefs even as they lose their force. The central teaching of the work is the call toward self-overcoming. Zarathustra urges humanity to move beyond complacency, resentment, and moral conformity. He introduces the vision of a higher form of human existence, not as a fixed goal, but as a continuous process of becoming. Growth, struggle, and contradiction are embraced rather than avoided. In this way, Zarathustra rejects moral systems that promise safety or redemption at the cost of vitality. Life, Nietzsche insists, must be affirmed even in its pain and uncertainty. Stylistically, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unlike anything else in philosophy. Its language is rhythmic, dramatic, and emotionally charged. Nietzsche uses repetition, metaphor, and irony to provoke rather than instruct. The text often resists clear interpretation, forcing readers to wrestle with its meaning rather than passively absorb it. This difficulty is intentional. Nietzsche believed that profound ideas should challenge the reader's habits of thought, breaking intellectual comfort and demanding active engagement. The legacy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is immense and complex. It has inspired philosophers, writers, artists, and critics across generations, while also being misunderstood, misused, and oversimplified. Nietzsche himself regarded it as his most personal and significant work, a book written for all and for none. Its enduring power lies not in providing answers, but in posing a radical challenge: to abandon inherited certainties and take responsibility for the creation of meaning. In this sense, Thus Spoke Zarathustra remains not just a major work, but a turning point in the history of modern thought. The critique of morality, religion, and modern culture reaches one of its most radical and influential expressions in the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche. Rather than treating moral values as timeless truths, this perspective approaches them as historical creations shaped by power, fear, and human psychology. Moral systems are not presented as neutral guides to goodness, but as tools that societies use to regulate behavior, preserve order, and justify authority. By asking not what morality teaches, but where it comes from and whom it serves. This critique undermines the comforting belief that moral rules are universal or divinely sanctioned. At the heart of this analysis lies a sharp distinction between life-affirming and life-denying values. Traditional moral frameworks, especially those dominant in the West, are portrayed as elevating humility, obedience, and self-denial, while casting strength, ambition, and creative power as dangerous or sinful. Such values are interpreted as emerging from historical conditions in which the weak, unable to act directly against the powerful, transformed their resentment into moral judgment. Over time, this moral inversion recast weakness as virtue and strength as vice, allowing moral language to become a subtle weapon rather than an honest expression of human flourishing. Religion occupies a central place in this critique, particularly institutionalized forms that claim absolute truth and moral authority. Religious belief systems are examined not primarily as spiritual paths, but as cultural structures that give suffering a moral meaning and promise compensation beyond this world. By redirecting hope toward an afterlife, religion is seen as encouraging resignation rather than transformation, endurance rather than creation. The emphasis on guilt, sin, and redemption fosters an internalized discipline, shaping individuals who police themselves according to inherited doctrines rather than forging their own values. In this view, religion does not merely guide behavior, it reshapes the human instinct itself. Modern culture, despite presenting itself as rational and progressive, is not spared from criticism. Secular society often replaces religious absolutes with new idols: mass opinion, economic productivity, nationalism, or the illusion of moral neutrality. These forces continue the same pattern of conformity, discouraging deep questioning and rewarding comfort over courage. Education, media, and political discourse tend to flatten differences, promoting average ideals that are safe, manageable, and widely acceptable. What appears as freedom often masks a deeper uniformity, where individuals adopt prefabricated opinions rather than engaging in genuine self-examination. Underlying this entire critique is a call for a profound revaluation of values. Instead of accepting inherited moral codes, individuals are urged to confront uncertainty and take responsibility for creating meaning in a world without guaranteed truths. This task is neither easy nor comforting. It demands intellectual honesty, emotional strength, and a willingness to stand apart from the crowd. Yet it is precisely through this struggle that culture can renew itself. By exposing the historical and psychological roots of morality, religion, and modern norms, this critique opens space for a more honest, dynamic, and life-affirming understanding of what it means to be human. The final chapter of Friedrich Nietzsche's life is marked by a dramatic and tragic collapse that stands in stark contrast to the intensity and clarity of his earlier intellectual work. In January 1889, while living in Turin, Nietzsche suffered a sudden mental breakdown that permanently ended his ability to work as a philosopher. According to contemporary accounts, the collapse was abrupt and overwhelming, signaling a profound rupture rather than a slow decline. From this moment onward, the man who had relentlessly questioned morality, truth, and culture was no longer able to sustain coherent thought or independent life. The precise medical cause of Nietzsche's collapse has remained a subject of debate. 19th-century diagnoses pointed toward neurosyphilis, a condition then poorly understood and difficult to confirm. Modern scholars have proposed alternative explanations, including inherited neurological disorders, brain tumors, or forms of dementia. Regardless of the cause, the symptoms were unmistakable: disorganized speech, extreme emotional instability, delusions of grandeur, and a complete loss of philosophical control. His letters from this period, often referred to as the madness letters, reveal a mind no longer governed by reason, filled with fragmented proclamations and exaggerated identifications with historical and divine figures. After the collapse, Nietzsche was taken into medical care and soon became entirely dependent on others. He spent time in clinics and under constant supervision, unable to read, write, or recognize the significance of his own work. The philosopher who had once demanded radical self-mastery and intellectual courage was reduced to silence, his consciousness trapped in a state of confusion. This long mental darkness lasted more than a decade, an extended epilogue in which his body lived on, while his creative mind was irrevocably gone. Responsibility for Nietzsche's care eventually fell to his family, first to his mother and later to his sister. During these years, he lived quietly, removed from public life, unaware of the growing attention his writings were beginning to receive. Ironically, as Nietzsche himself faded into obscurity and illness, his ideas began to circulate more widely, provoking admiration, controversy, and misunderstanding across Europe. He never witnessed the impact of his philosophy, nor the debates it would ignite in the 20th century. His final years were marked not by struggle or reflection, but by complete withdrawal from the intellectual world he had once sought to overturn. Nietzsche died in 1900, still mentally incapacitated, bringing an end to one of the most intense philosophical lives of the modern age. His mental collapse has often been interpreted symbolically, as if the weight of his ideas consumed him. Yet such interpretations risk romanticizing real suffering. What remains undeniable is the stark contrast between the fierce independence of his thought and the helplessness of his final years. This tragic conclusion adds a somber human dimension to his legacy, reminding us that even the most powerful intellects are bound by the fragility of the body and the limits of the mind. The death of Friedrich Nietzsche in August 1900 passed almost quietly, receiving little of the public attention that would later surround his name. He died in Weimar after years of mental incapacity, his intellectual life long extinguished, and his physical presence reduced to a fragile remnant of the man who had once shaken the foundations of European thought. At the moment of his death, Nietzsche was far from a celebrated figure. His books were read by a small circle of admirers and critics, and his reputation remained marginal within academic philosophy. Yet this silence at his passing would soon give way to an extraordinary and controversial afterlife. In the years immediately following his death, Nietzsche's writings began to circulate more widely, propelled in part by the cultural crisis of the early 20th century. Industrialization, the decline of traditional religious authority, and the growing sense of moral uncertainty made his ideas suddenly feel urgent and prophetic. Concepts that had once seemed shocking or obscure, such as the critique of absolute morality, the challenge to religious certainty, and the demand for self-created values, now spoke directly to a generation searching for meaning in a rapidly changing world. Nietzsche, who had died unheard, was gradually transformed into a central figure of modern thought. This rise in fame, however, was accompanied by distortion and misuse. Nietzsche's work was often read selectively, stripped of nuance, and bent to serve ideological agendas he would likely have rejected. His complex reflections on power, culture, and human potential were reduced to slogans, while his fierce opposition to mass movements and blind obedience was conveniently ignored. The posthumous handling of his manuscripts further complicated his legacy, allowing interpretations to emerge that blurred the line between his authentic philosophy and later editorial influence. As a result, Nietzsche became both one of the most influential and most misunderstood thinkers of the modern age. Despite these controversies, Nietzsche's philosophical impact proved vast and enduring. His influence can be traced across existentialism, psychoanalysis, modern literature, and cultural criticism. Thinkers, artists, and writers found in his work a language for confronting anxiety, individuality, and the collapse of inherited values. Rather than offering a closed system of thought, Nietzsche provided a method, a way of questioning assumptions, exposing hidden motivations, and challenging comforting illusions. His style, provocative, poetic, and deliberately unsettling, invited interpretation rather than obedience, ensuring that his philosophy remained alive through debate rather than frozen into doctrine. Today, Nietzsche's legacy is recognized not as a set of final answers, but as an ongoing challenge. He forced modern culture to confront uncomfortable questions about truth, morality, and the cost of intellectual honesty. His posthumous fame rests not on consensus, but on tension, between admiration and unease, inspiration and danger. In this sense, Nietzsche achieved a kind of immortality he never witnessed in life. His death marked the end of a solitary human existence, but the beginning of a philosophical presence that continues to provoke, disturb, and reshape the way modern humanity understands itself.